Hello again, and welcome back to the European Data Summit and to the panel Business to Government Data Sharing. When we planned this panel, we thought we were going to have the same exclusivity as with the Data Governance Act. As you know, there was a compromise 2 days ago, and we have discussed it yesterday during the European Data Summit. Unfortunately, we don't have the draft of the Data Act, we just have the impact assessment. But that's a good reason also to have a discussion with prominent speakers and also to have the Commission on board. I'm really happy that Maria Rosaria is representing the DG Connect in this discussion and is with us, is going to tell us a bit more regarding the approach of the Commission and the intention of the legislator. Stefaan Verhulst, the co-founder of the very famous GovLab from the New York University and one of the members of the expert group in charge of the European Commission. Then we have Jakob Greiner, the Vice President, European Affairs from Deutsche Telekom, so to say, the regular participant of the European Data Summit. I'm really happy that you're again with us. Carla Dietmair, who is a PhD candidate at the Humboldt University and also former advisor in the German Parliament in the AA committee. And we have Szymon Chignard, the former expert of ETALab, the Prime Minister Division of the French government for open data, and advisor of the French government. We're really glad that you are with us. Again, also regular participant of the European Data Summit. The crisis has shown the importance of data for the functioning of the public authorities. We have many examples where the public authorities are dependent on data that is currently or that is under control of the business sector. There are enough reasons why the European Commission is trying to address this issue in a more concrete way in the upcoming Data Act. We have exclusive opportunity to discuss issue with Maria Rosaria, and I'm really glad that you are joining this event. Dear Maria, could you tell us a bit more about the motivation and your approach in dealing with B2G in the context of the upcoming Data Act? And maybe to tell us, why do we have a short delay with the first proposal of this legislative act?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for inviting me to this very timely conference. And of course, the topic of business to government data sharing for the public interest is very relevant, and I've been working on this intensively during the last 3 years, I must say. We all know that every day we produce data that tells something about us, that gives information about where we go, where we eat, how much energy resources we consume. Our smart objects and smartphone applications collect this data, and thus most of it is still in the hands of the private sector. So at the Commission, we thought about the value that such information has to help public authorities to provide us with the efficient public services and policies. And we concluded that if public sector bodies could access the data collected by the private sector, they could better organize public transportation in cities, provide more efficient healthcare, make our cities greener, face crises more efficiently. So to explore the issue more in depth, we set up in 2018 a high-level expert group on business to government data sharing for the public interest. And those 23 experts, amongst which Stefan, helped us find a way to make business to government data sharing happen at a scale in a responsible, sustainable way in the European Union. And after 1 year of work, the group produced a very extremely informative report that contains several recommendations to boost business to government data sharing for the public interest. And those recommendations are about governance for business to government data sharing across the European Union, on transparency, on citizen engagement, on ethics of business to government data sharing as well, on operational models, structures, technical tools to make B2G data sharing happen. And the group also revised the B2G data sharing principles that we published in 2018 and included also new principles on accountability, one on fair and ethical data use in business to government data sharing relationship. So we have taken those recommendations into account in our data strategy, which we published in February 2020, which announced the creation of the Data Act. And this EU legal framework would, among other things, bring also some certainty to business to government data sharing partnership and help overcome related barriers. This framework could set the objectives, general obligations and safeguards that should be put in place for B2G data sharing and the specific conditions under which public authorities can use privately held data, including compensation modalities, all these factors could be considered. This is the initiative is of an unprecedented scale because it's the first time that we try to provide member states with an harmonized framework for business to government data sharing. And we are exploring these issues for the Data Act, as Benjo mentioned, that B2G will be one part of the Act that aims at achieve a fair distribution of the value of data by clarifying who can do which with data and under which conditions. And at the same time, the Data Act would also ensure that the legitimate interests of individuals, as well as companies investing in data generating activities, are respected. A fair allocation of value among the actors involved in the data economy is necessary to foster data sharing among businesses and between businesses and governments as well. So this is the overview of what we are working on currently at the moment. And you're right that there is going to be a slightly delay, but just because we need a little bit more of time to prepare the proposal, to reflect, and to really still to work on it. So, but it's coming for sure.
Many thanks for your initial remarks, Maria Rosaria. So let's hear the industry voice. Jakob, I can imagine that you are not that satisfied with this current approach by the Commission, and you have reasons for that. Why that?
Thank you, Pencho, and thanks for being here, and thanks to my co-speakers also for being there. Well, I cannot yet say whether I'm disappointed or enthusiastic because we have not really seen anything formally adopted or published by the Commission except for the expert group that Maria Rosaria mentioned. Maybe just to a background why I'm sitting here. It's Deutsche Telekom is of course also cooperating with the public sector, and we've seen it especially in the pandemic now. We have been directly working with the Robert Koch Institute, for example. We are working with the European Commission, and we are providing aggregated mobility data to them in a anonymized form to be able to see and assess the effects of lockdown, of movements, of contingency measures. So I would say just looking at the past 1.5 years, at least from a telecom's perspective, I would say cooperation is there and is actually working. And rightfully, however, since 4 years, I think it was 4 years ago that we've been sitting here on the very same subject matter, this can be done better. I think there's no doubt about it. Why? Because we are still seeing not enough cooperation between private actors and governments and public authorities, and also not sustainable long-term cooperation. So the question is, what is the reason for that? And I'm sure we're going to dive into that more in detail in the next minutes. But just to say, yes, of course, there is a certain insecurity about let's say, the purpose limitation for what are public authorities requiring data, safeguards, data protection. I recall a lot of discussions with data protection authorities when it came to this cooperation of mobile network operators and the European Commission, questions about what is an anonymized data. So obviously many reservations in that regard that needs to be solved. And now I'm looking at least at those leaked documents that we've seen and the discussions that we had in the last 4 years. I'm looking at how the Commission wants to tackle that. And what strikes me here is that they are talking a lot about the how, which I fully agree. How can you improve the cooperation? But they are also talking a lot about the if, and their solution about whether cooperation happens or not seems to be that they just want to oblige the private sector to hand out data for specific reasons that seem to be narrowly defined. But from what I've read so far, I have a question mark about the narrow definition when we're talking about health, environment, crisis management. These are all very pressing issues, but the question is how narrowly defined is that you get legal certainty as a company to for what purposes you are going to hand out data. And so you already see from my comment, we're not necessarily agreeing with the fact that an obligation is the best solution. I'm also not agreeing with the fact that there should be some predefined, let's say, cost regulation that tells the private sector how much the private sector can charge or not charge at all for certain public interest cases, because even though there might be the expectation that Deutsche Telekom is a public commodity, we're not, we're a private company. And a last remark, and then happy to discuss further, we are also, of course, not, let's say, Google, Facebook, or others, where our core business is data analysis. Our core business is broadband deployment. And so what we are doing with data and what we have been doing with data now in the past 2 years, helping public authorities is, let's say, a sideline, a business that has also considerable effort that we bring to this, resources, money, etc. And so to sum it up, I would say if we want to increase cooperation, we need to have a win and win situation for the public and the private sector, and that also means adequate compensation, very well-defined public interest cases, and happy to discuss further then.
Many thanks, Jakob. This reminds me a bit to the open data PSI discussion where we had the similar issue with the costs, be it marginal costs or the situation with the high-value data sets where at the European level we're trying to reach a compromise that those kind of data sets must be free of charge. But maybe we can discuss it also later. Also the issue of conditions, how you approach at least Robert Koch Institute or how do you approach public institutions when they request data from you. I would like to hear something from you, dear Carla, from a scientific point of view. There are obvious reasons for for regulatory intervention in this field, and do you see any market failure that's supposed to be addressed in the context of the upcoming Data Act?
Well, let me start with an example of what we are talking about when we talk about business-to-government data sharing. So, I don't know if you know how in German cities transport is planned or how the data is gathered for that, but what happens is someone sits at a street corner and counts how many cars and bicycles drive by. And because that's very resource intensive, it happens every 4 years. Less so in smaller German towns. Now, this is neither a very up-to-date nor detailed databases. Meanwhile, we have mobility data almost in real time by sharing providers. We have mobility data from telecommunications. And I think that's at the core question of our debate. How do we bring these public tasks that, as Maria has said, need to be improved, can be made more efficient, together with the data that is out there held by private companies. And it's happening already. I mean, in many cities, municipality context, at the state level here in Germany, we already have regulation. For example, you have utilities that need to share heating or electricity data in order to plan for the municipalities to plan more renewable electricity consumption. So coming back to your question, is there a market failure? Well, from a regulatory perspective or public law, where I'm coming from, it's the state is not always a market actor. There is already a regulation. If there is a will by the lawmaker, by the legislator, then you can certainly implement these sharing obligations. Is that the right way? Is that the way to where you actually have implementation? I think there you have to be, as Jakob said, and I agree, sector-specific. You have to really look at the public interest, the public task that you want to improve. And I think there we have a broad variety of instruments that we need to really look at.
Many thanks. But the current approach is not sector-specific. So you basically are questioning the possibility to address all the relevant issue on one place.
Especially at the level of the European Union. I mean, it's a great initiative, but I think the national legislator is already doing something, and the state legislator is also doing something. So you need to look at several levels, and an overall holistic framework also addresses all of these layers.
Many thanks for the clarification. Szymon, you've been working in this field for many, many years. I mean, you are open data specialist, and you have great projects in the city of Rennes. In the second part, Marion is going to tell us the story of B2G data sharing in the city of Rennes. But could you tell us a bit more about your project, RUDI, and your experiences? Why all these provisions in the upcoming Data Act would matter, and why they are relevant?
Yeah. Thank you, Pencho. Regarding RUDI, which stands for Rennes Urban Data Interface, this is a data sharing platform at the local level, but I will let Marion Glatron to give an overview not only of the platform but the project itself. So coming back to the question of B2G data sharing, first, I fully agree with Jakob. 4 years ago, we were already sitting there discussing the topic, so it's not really such a new topic, but still, I have the feeling that it's already happening, as Carla mentioned it. A few years ago, in 2016, in France, as you know, we passed a Digital Republic Bill, and in this bill, we had two provisions regarding B2G data sharing. The first one is about the utility sector, as Carla mentioned, the fact that private company providing energy, water, waste management, transportation, when they work as a concession, they have to provide local public authorities very detailed information about the concession, but the performance of the service, and so on and so on. So that's the first point. But more interestingly, in the Digital Republic Bill, there is also an article that enables the National Statistical Office, in French, INSEE, to access data from the private sector. Back then, it was, I think, in Europe, one of the most advanced legal approach to give a framework and a process to give access to private sector data for statistical purpose, or for public interest purpose more broadly. I have to mention that it's already happening, and since the beginning of last year, 2020, in France, the national measure of inflation is based partly on the analysis of receipts from supermarkets. So it's happening right now. I have to say that in the bill, what we have made is a process based on transparency, accountability. You have to prove the level of public interest. You have to publish an impact assessment, and so on and so on. So it works, first. Second thing is it takes really a long time to put in practice. When I said we passed the law 5 years ago, and we just start to see things working on that matter. What this means, basically, it's taking too long. So that's my first point. My second point is, as we unfortunately all know, there is a pandemic going on. And in many aspects, I think that the pandemic worked as an accelerator of B2G data sharing. But the thing is, yesterday, and I'm sure he's going to elaborate on that right now, Stefaan from TheGovLab said that most agreements have been made based on a pro bono. That's really, really interesting to focus on that question of pro bono, because I think there has been from the private sector a double incentive to work with public sector. The first one, of course, it's really, really positive one, is to say, okay, we have to help society and we have to help governments to face this challenge of the pandemic. Okay, so let's talk about corporates, social responsibility and so on. This is really, really the good face of showing that you care for the society as a whole. That's the first one. But I must say also that I think there have been another incentive, which is much more interesting to look at, is the fact that for many private companies, they don't want to be seen as making profit from the situation. So, for instance, we have seen mobile phone companies in France, so it's not Deutsche Telekom, just to make Jakob quite
France Telecom.
relaxed about what I'm going to say. We have seen some mobile phone companies who were trying to sell their solution, their data analytics solution, before the pandemic, and during the pandemic they said, okay, it's free to reuse, it's free to use, you have just to make it and so on. So, for me, let's have a look at what this pro bono approach means. Basically, I think there are, and there are still right now, a lot of misunderstanding about what really the value of data is, from both sides. From the public sector, that sometimes we have struggled to understand what really the kind of data that private companies own, how we can access it, and so on and so on. But at the same time, from the private sector, I also see some misunderstanding of what really a public sector authority is, how competent they are to deal with data, what they really want to achieve, and so on and so on. So let's hope that this pandemic and that this pro bono approach can be used as a way to maybe have a better mutual understanding of the situation and not a loss of opportunity. But because I'm really afraid that once the pandemic is over, hopefully it will be over one day, what we have learned during this fast will be lost.
Many thanks, dear Szymon. Do you believe, let's say we have a situation where the industry is collaborative, optimistic scenario, is the public administration at all in a position to analyze those amounts of data and take evidence-based decision, in France at least?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We have seen many data collaboration between Waze, a Google-owned company that you all know, because in Europe, Waze set up a program called, I think, Connected Citizens Program, which basically means that they share information about disruption, travel disruption, road disruption, and at the same time, local public authorities will also share information about planned roadworks and so on. To be honest, what I have seen is that most of the times, local public authorities don't really know how to act upon this kind of data, right? Because they lack sometimes skills or competencies, but also that's not so easy to disrupt or to change the way you take decision as a public sector actor. Right? We have a lot of discussion yesterday about data-driven decision and so on, but it's quite a new field. So I hope that we will see, and maybe not as Martin Luther King, but I have a dream, let's say. And my dream is that I think there is a direct link between the debate about B2B data sharing and B2G data sharing. My dream is that we will see companies in specific sectors, let's talk about agriculture or health or automotive industry, that going to speak together, but also to speak to the public sector, saying, okay, not only do we want to share data in a data sharing pool for us to make value, but maybe also to use these data sharing pools as a connection to public sector and to be able to say, okay, this is the kind of information, this is the kind of data that we can use to help the public sector to take public interest decision.
Many thanks. I hope Stefaan is listening to us. Stefaan, you are one of the most prominent voices when it comes to B2G and B2G data sharing and open data in general. You've been a member in the expert group appointed by the European Commission. What were your findings and why B2G matters that much, especially nowadays?
Right, well, thanks, Pencho, for having me, and delighted to be on this distinguished panel. And I think many of the panelists already indicated what I was planning on saying, and also Maria gave a good introduction on why this matters and why we may want to really take this seriously, because obviously this is about the quality of decisions that impact us all. And I think if we are honest, then we can basically really say is that the current environment in which we make decisions that affect the public interest clearly need to be improved, and quite often still happens in almost like a pre-digital kind of environment. And so if we really want to improve society, then we're going to have to improve the way we go about making decisions. And that means, and I think the whole conference of the last 2 days have been about the potential value of data. That also means that we're going to have to find a way to actually accelerate how we use data, but also how we have access to data that can improve society at large, including improve the situation in which corporations act. Because I think the quality of the decisions also impacts, of course, the environment in which businesses operate. So it's not just a societal issue, it's also an environment with regard to business. And Carla already gave an example with regard to transportations and the fact indeed that much of the decisions with regard to mobility in cities are basically based upon an analog way of collecting data, which means that we still don't know, for instance, anyway, how we will deal with traffic jams, which, by the way, several studies have pointed that adds on an annual basis 2,000 euros per family because we get stuck in traffic that often if we don't understand how traffic works. But also it has implications, for instance, from a gender perspective. I mean, we've done some work leveraging telecom data to actually show that mobility is gendered and that we cannot approach, for instance, mobility as if everyone has the same kind of needs when it comes to public transportation or when it comes to mobility as well. Anyway, I can give you many examples where access to data, and especially access to non-traditional data sets, might actually improve the way we go about decisions, including, and of course we had a panel yesterday, saving people's lives. And I think the fact that we will likely have more and more crises as a result of climate change means that we actually also going to have to become more and more data-driven in how we respond to some of the emergencies that we will see as well in order to actually save people's lives as well. Anyway, I think the societal case is strong. The question then is, of course, how do we indeed leverage the data that has already been collected instead of collecting more data, and quite often data that is not real-time and quite often not as granular than the data that is already collected. How do we provide access to that? Because I think the discussion about B2G is quite often about sharing, right? As if transfer of data needs to happen. And I think we already have seen that that quite often doesn't have to be the case. It's really about access to data and then subsequently reusing that data that can start anyway, reusing that data for other purposes. Now, the real challenge here, and again, we've seen many examples, and frankly, I have to congratulate the telecom sector, and it's kind of quite often, remarkable that the telecom sector quite often get criticized because they actually do provide access to some of their data, because there are many other sectors that actually are still lacking in collaborating. So we've seen many examples. The real challenge here is how do we do this in a more systematic, so it's not always a one-off. And I agree with Szymon as well, is that my fear in the current environment with the collaborations in the context of COVID-19 might be, again, another one-off kind of experience. So how do we do this in a more systematic way, in a more sustainable way, because there are indeed costs involved from both sides, but also in a responsible way, because we are talking about, of course, reusing of data that was collected for one purpose, and now we're going to start using it for another purpose. And so we also need to think about the ethical implications and the expectations, as Maria was referring to, the expectations of citizens with regard to how that data is being used. And so what we focused on at the B2G data sharing expert group was really about that question of how to make it more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. And I think the key message here was that is that we need to really think in terms of partnerships, and that this is really about creating new partnerships between the public, the private, and people in some occasions. And I think that that is really what the focus should be about. But that also, of course, that we do need to find a way, to express the demand for the data in a more sophisticated and reliable manner. And so one of the suggestions within the expert group was to really come up with national coordination kind of mechanisms and processes to identify the demand for data, so that we actually have a clear understanding on what are some priority use cases around which we should then work together. The second, in addition to strengthening the demand, the other, in order to make it more systematic, was to actually develop a profession or a function in order to indeed, when there is a request, actually have a more systematic way of responding to the request. At the moment, Pencho, and again, we saw that also within the context of COVID-19, when there is a clear public interest request, the real challenge at the moment is who do you even ask, and how do we even facilitate a response that is methodological, but also reliable. And so absence that function, which we call, anyway, and which we also discussed in the B2G data sharing group, which we call data stewards, or a data stewardship function, it's very hard to actually take out the transaction cost of engaging with the private sector, both within the private sector, but also from the public sector around repurposing data, because there is no designated kind of function. And we've seen, again, within the telecom sectors, several, of course, of those data stewardship functions emerging. We've seen it also in other sectors where there is a data for good kind of function. But we really need to professionalize that. And then we need to connect them in order to really make this more methodological, as opposed to always inventing as if this is a new kind of request. And so that will take out some of the transaction costs that we believe that is currently in place. It will also, the role of the data steward will also be not only to reflect on the societal case, but also what's the business case. And clearly, several already have pointed to that. In many cases, there is, of course, a strong societal case, which is why I feel corporations should obviously also step up, because I think, as we all know, part of the license to operate is to actually contribute to society. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is important to at least take notice. But in many cases, there is also a business case. And in some cases, that's reciprocity, i.e. I have access to other data, or I have access to domain expertise that I otherwise would not have. In some cases, it's better research. And I think research with regard to, for instance, new market opportunities that might emerge by actually having new insights on how society works. And in other cases, it's indeed even revenue. And I don't think we should be shy to talk about possible additional revenue streams as a result of working with the public sector, not only by having the public sector pay for it, but also by actually, anyway, developing new models of analysis that then can be monetized through other means. And we've seen this in many ways, that is actually one of the business cases for working with that. Now, once you have a strong demand, once you have actually a data stewardship environment, both in the public and the private sector, that can respond to the demand in a more systematic way, then you still need, of course, ways to de-risk the relationship. And I think that's another reason why it's important to actually have a legal or regulatory instrument that can de-risk some of the environments in which that sharing happens, both in risk from for corporations, but also risks for individuals, of course. And so we do need to have a better governance environment. And the last thing I will say, Pencho, because I don't want to take too much time, is that we also, of course, need to make sure that people are trusting the way this is happening. And so we do need to think about a social license for B2G data sharing, because the previous panel already identified the challenges with consent. And I think the same challenge exists with regard to, of course, consent as it relates to using data that was collected for one purpose for another purpose. And I think we really have to start thinking about how do we acquire that kind of social license for B2G. Social license, of course, through deliberation, but also social license, for instance, through actually a more regulatory, secure environment in which that B2G data sharing happens.
Many thanks. We really appreciate your words. You know better than myself that we have convergence in the debate when it comes to competition and antitrust, especially since you have Lina Khan as a new commissioner in the United States. Do we have the same convergence in the debate when it comes to B2G? What's the situation in the States?
Well, meaning again, the States, of course, has a different approach. Meaning, I think what happens in the States is that a lot of those discussions with regard to B2G are actually evolving to the local level. Many cities have taken a proactive role, as also was referring by Carla and Szymon, I guess. Many cities are taking a more proactive role with regard to actually shaping their data ecosystem, where they start thinking about how can we actually leverage the data that is collected within our city for our city. And we've seen many examples, and we are part of some of the examples here in New York, where actually, city government are working together and quite often have regulatory mechanisms to enable collaboration around, for instance, mobility data. And so I think a lot of the discussion about B2G happens at the local level or at the state level, for that matter, when it comes to, for instance, healthcare. Now, there is, of course, a strong interest also within the statistical environment, because I think an important actor within this whole discussion, of course, that should not be ignored, are statistical offices that obviously have a duty to provide the best possible information to society, not just to government, on how society works. And I think there is a strong case to be made that if statistical offices provide better analysis, we will all be better off, and especially if it's more real time, so that the decisions both within the private and the public sector can be made better. And I think the statistical office within the US clearly is starting to look more and more into how they can access non-traditional data. And there are already multiple examples, similar as in Europe, where there are multiple examples. Now, again, those are quite often exploratory. There are one-offs. There is no sustainability model attached to it. And it's still pilot phase. And I think the real challenge to society is to really, how do we make this more in a trusted, systematic, and reliable way moving forward, so that we actually can really improve the way we go about making decisions. And I think we will see some action here within the US as well. Now, of course, this also happens within the OECD. This is not unique to Europe. And the OECD has also, of course, issued their recommendations with regard to B2G data sharing that is similar to some of the discussions that we've had today.
Thanks for mentioning OECD. We're going to have Christian in the next session regarding B2B data sharing. But we are having this discussion because of obvious public interest, Maria Rosaria. Across the EU, however, the notion of public interest is still quite uncertain and fragmented, in my opinion. Do you think there is a room for harmonization at European level?
Thanks for the question. Actually, it's not in the remit of the competencies of the European Union to define public interest for member states. Public interest really also depends on the history, on the culture, on the constitutional history of a country. And so it would be extremely difficult to come up with a definition of public interest that, would be valid for all the member states. And it's not really necessary. I mean, B2G for public interest will be done by public sector bodies that, in a way, by definition or by default, they operate for the interest of their constituencies or of their citizens. What is more important is to really streamline the process, to have precise safeguards in place, precise instructions on how, for example, a request for B2G has to be done, in which cases, which are the principles that apply. And I still gather that there are some misperception about what we are trying to do here. Of course, we don't think that the data that private companies collect is a let's say, a public good. We have some policies on open data, but those are about data that is produced by the public sector using public sector money. So there's no intention to try to treat the data of the public sector as a public commodity, of course. And all what we are going to do on B2G will be extremely respectful of the interest of the companies. We will not create any burden for companies. We will respect any existing legislation in terms of IP rights, trade secrets, as well as we will respect any legislation that deals with privacy, with data protection, etc. Even if I want to recall that the General Data Protection Regulation is already a legal basis for further processing of personal data in the public interest. But of course, B2G data sharing will in principle be more focused on non-personal data or anonymized data. And when any personal data will be required, it will be shared under the highest level of security and respecting all the existing legislation.
Maybe one additional question, because Jakob already mentioned, we have discussed, I think, 2018 with Malte Bayer, the guidelines at that time. And now we are basically 2-3 years later, and isn't it too early to conclude that the guidelines are not working and there is a real regulatory need? You made probably consultation. You made consultation before. Could you tell us a bit more? Why are you going really in this direction?
Because the non-binding principles that we published in 2018 have not created any sustainable, scalable, and systematic business-to-government data sharing system in Europe. We have some member states that are moving forward on this policy. For example, France, that has already been mentioned by the colleague. Finland has done something as well. We just want to provide an harmonized framework to make sure that there is not legal fragmentation. To make sure also that, for example, companies don't need to deal with 27 different legal regimes on how B2G has to be done. And then we also have conducted several online public consultations where stakeholders are telling us that B2G is really not happening, that the conditions are not clear, and it's the spirit of the data strategy of trying to improve sharing of data in Europe for the benefit of the society and of the economy. So the Data Act is trying to also implement the spirit of the data strategy. And the philosophy of B2G is that we really have tried to use more the data that is already there. As Stefan was saying, we are not asking for new data, it's data that is already collected. And one of the characteristics of data is that it can be used, shared, reused several times without being damaged. So we think that is the moment to, especially after the COVID crisis, especially after we see, what the changes of the climate changes and the crisis that we have to deal with every day. All these factors just shows us that we need to use data that is already collected, putting in place all the safeguards and respecting all the legislation, of course, but we need to use it more for the benefit of the society and the economy by respecting the rights of everyone.
Many thanks. The issue or the obligation would relate to public interest, but also to crisis situation, Jakob. I think this is one of the central issues when it comes to B2G. How do you perceive this issue? Why is that important?
I take the liberty to not answer your question, but to come to 4 points that I have on my list now.
But please go on. Yeah,
but
you can take also the previous 4 points.
So, number one, when I listen to fragmentation and the fear of fragmentation in Europe, I want to highlight that we're talking about, indeed, France, Finland, and the UK, who's no longer in the EU. So I think we cannot say that 15, 16 member states have implemented an open data policy about business to government, and that's why we now need to harmonize. Second, I want to pick up what Stefan said, and I really liked everything he said. He summarized perfectly the 100-page expert report. Nobody has to read it anymore. But he talked about partnership. He talked about how to make this more systemic and sustainable. And I really want to be a bit provocative, asking whether forcing companies through a legal regime is the right way ahead for partnership. And I want to make a comparison to open data. So data of the taxpayer that lies somewhere in some public authorities. You mentioned, Penshu, the PSI, the Public Sector Information Directive. There's also the Data Governance Act that goes in the same direction. And they have created a legal regime that doesn't force public authorities to open up data for better use by private actors, because it's also reciprocal. We could use some public data as well. They don't force them. They just hand out a governance framework and set conditions, safeguards, how to do that better. And by the way, they can get adequately compensated. I don't know what adequate means, but it's in the law, so they charge money for that. And if I compare that now to the ideas of the Commission to force the private sector, not only talking about me, I mean, when we're talking about environment, this is not only telco, this is basically everybody. To force and send out data and in parts at no cost, I'm not sure that this is the win-win situation that I described earlier. Third, I have to say thrilled about the discussions that we're having now about opening up data by the private sector, while since 4 years we are discussing the e-privacy regulation. And you need to discuss it when you're talking about telecoms data. If I understand right, the Commission's plans are not only to free up anonymized data, it's also about personal data. And when we have fought for 4 years about further processing of communications data and trying to get the same flexibility as, rightfully said, it is enshrined in the GDPR, and it's not the case in the e-privacy, and we can only further process data if we have a consent or with anonymization, then I wonder how a 4-year-old, 5-year-old law matches with the ambition that we are seeing today in the EU data strategy. And the last point is about the definition of public interest and public purposes. I fully understand there is no harmonized definition of it, but I just want to send out a warning. You know, we would be very, very happy to incentivize and to increase cooperation with public authorities. And we do not yet see too many demands coming. We've seen it a lot in the pandemic, sometimes very, very uncoordinated. Some ministries, some Bundesländer calling through, hey, do you have some data lying around that you can somehow send over per email and try to help us fight the pandemic? I'm just saying it a bit, you know, overstretched, because there is indeed no real governance system, and we would appreciate such a government system. We would appreciate maybe also having some kind of a public register that somehow shows the availability of data by the private sector. No problem about it. But what I want to say is, if we come into a situation where every member state and every region can define for itself what a public interest purpose is, and based on that approach any company asking every month or every 3 months for some data, then we have a problem. And that's why I can only pledge that whatever is going to be written in this Data Act is indeed narrowly defined, clearly defined, so that we as the private sector have legal certainty when we need to or want to hand out data. And again, last point, I would really like to make the pledge: continue voluntary cooperation, but provide a guidance framework on the how of the communication. And if it doesn't work, fine, come with the obligation. But for now, that's what you rightfully said, Pencho, it's 3 years ago. I don't really see the market failure. Is it an interest in general to somehow increase cooperation? Yes, we're fully committed to it. But does it mean forcing private actors to hand out data? I'm not sure. I think there's a middle way.
I think the notion in the Inception impact assessment was referring to crisis situation, and definitely defining crisis situation is not that simple.
No, and sorry, I forgot one last point, if I may. And that's what there is indeed an Inception impact assessment from the Commission, and we were startled by one sentence. The sentence said, we do not have enough cooperation because the private sector doesn't hand out the data, and the public sector could do so much in terms of analysis with such data. And there I have to concur what the colleagues before said. We do not see from our experience that the public sector is ready to deal with the analysis by itself. As a matter of fact, they ask us to do analysis, and we very much are enthusiastic to doing that. We're also doing this as a business, indeed. So we need to be careful not to carve out initiatives that we're already doing on the ground. And so I would just pledge more also for, and I think the expert group says it, increasing skills, resources, not only on the private sector side, but also on the public sector side, to be able to handle the data. Because what I don't want to see, last sentence, is that we are sending out data to a public authority, and the public authority outsources the data to some big company that is capable to do so, because then we are indeed the dump pipe that the telecoms always complain about.
Many thanks. I would continue the discussion in the same sphere, but I would like to ask something else, Carla. If challenges for increased B2G data sharing are not technical at heart, but rather organizational, legal, cultural, and political in nature, what do you think are the most pressing ones, and how do you think they could be overcome?
Well, I think I can very easily follow up on what Jakob has said, because he's mentioned very important points. First, I think, and here I have to disagree with the Commission, I think we're looking at the wrong level, and as Stefan has said, most of B2G is happening at the local level. So I am also doubtful how to define a public interest from the level of the European Union. I'm not even sure it's necessary. But on the local level, you already have fragmentation. So in Germany, in several Bundesländern, like for example, Hamburg, Baden-Württemberg, Schleswig-Holstein, they have already data sharing obligations for utilities in terms of heat and electricity consumption. Now, in one state, businesses have to cover the costs, in one they don't. In one state, personal data can be processed, in another they can't. So we have fragmentization, we have legal uncertainty, and I think that needs to be addressed. Second, I think that's the first challenge. The second challenge is personal data. It's the elephant in the room. Most of the data, especially when we're talking about the local level, it is produced by citizens, and it can be personal. It can be even useful, right? I mean, and the GDPR in Article 6 clearly allows for processing of personal data in terms of public interest. As Maria has mentioned, that's a very clear sign to open up for national interests and national contexts. So there is a possibility, but we need a broad discussion. And of course, I mean, in terms of Germany, Article 6 GDPR is not in itself a justification for that. We need a parliamentary law. We don't need, and also a general framework would not be sufficient. We need a specific law with a specific purpose.
Many thanks. Having in mind the time, Szymon, if you would, I know you're advising your government, but if you would advise at this moment the Commission, what would you say?
Okay, so it was okay for Jakob not to answer your question, so I was wondering
You're going to avoid.
Really
Okay, you can avoid.
to answer your question. No, basically, I'm not sure I have any advice to give to the Commission, but maybe something which should really focus on is that question of the people and the public perception when it comes to that question. Last year in France, we made a public consultation, and basically it was just a website, and we gave people 10 different use cases of potential use of privately held data for public interest. And we, for instance, you have one use case about how could local public authorities access data from job boards, such as LinkedIn, to better understand the local job markets, for instance. We made very clear that none of these use cases involved personal data. Still, we were really shocked by the level of criticism that we received online. Basically, the public perception of that is not so clear, and for many reasons. The first one is, I think there is some kind of GDPR halo effect, in meaning that for many people, they've seen that as a risk to their privacy, even though we were very careful to say, okay, we are not speaking about personal data. That's the first point. And the second one, it comes directly back to the question of who defines the public interest, meaning that many people ask us, okay, you said that it's public interest because you are the government or you are the local public authorities. So by design, you are in charge of the public interest. But I will question that. I'm not sure that for many Europeans, we can say that public interest is just the thing that government, national and local one, are in charge of.
Many thanks. Dear Stefaan, if you could reflect on what was previously said and maybe your final conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, a lot was said, and I'm going to pick up your question as well. Is that if we would think about prioritization, are there ways that we can prioritize certain kinds of interventions that might accelerate some of the systematic, sustainable, and responsible access to privately held data? And from my point of view, having worked now for the last 8 or 9 years with the private sector and the public sector on those issues, there's one big takeaway, which is that there is no one way of doing this, and there are X amount of variables that need to be taken into account to structure the partnership that is fit for purpose. Because I think exactly it has to be purpose-led, but that also means that there are different ways of addressing the way we go about addressing the purpose, and that's why we have come to the realization that this requires an investment in a new function, which we call the data stewards function, both within the private and the public sector, that actually can figure this out by having an ongoing kind of relationship and partnership building effort. And if there is one thing that would help, is that if actually we would have that kind of cadre of data stewards across private sector, but also within the public sector, because there was already a discussion about the lack of capacity. But one of the reasons why there's a lack of capacity or fragmentation, for that matter, with regard to the demand from the public sector is because we need to have that kind of function that can translate the need into a question and then can figure out what is then actually required in order to start answering that question in terms of data assets, but also in terms of the operational model for doing so. And I think if we would have that kind of human infrastructure, then I think a lot of the transaction costs would be taken out, and we would actually have, over time, a more methodological way of doing this. And so from my point of view, that's something that we really need to invest in, and anyway, could make a difference. And that could be at the local level, at the national level, but I think it's really a new kind of profession that we need in order to facilitate that kind of stewardship function.
Many thanks, dear Stefan. Dear Maria Rosaria, I hope that the opinion of experts is valuable to DG Connect, especially at this stage. If you could reflect on what was previously said and your final remarks.
Yes, of course. It's really appreciated. Now, I just want to make clear once again that B2G data sharing is not about opening up data for companies. It is not about opening up personal data of European citizens. And this has to be very clear, because this is the kind of narrative that disqualifies B2G. B2G is using data that has already been collected in a secure way, in a trusted way, for the benefit of the society. Thank you.
Many thanks. I would give the final words first to Jakob and then to Carla.
I think I said so much in my previous one. I'll hand it over to Carla.
Okay.
Well, I would like to pick up one point from you that you said, and I certainly agree also what you have said, Szymon, the resources and responsibilities of the public body. Yeah, of course we need the resources to handle the data, and a public body has certain responsibilities. They need to be able to do a quality control of the data, etc. Where I don't agree is this kind of outsourcing, because that's what the public sector is already doing, right? I mentioned the example of mobility data in the beginning. You already have planning bureaus that collect and gather and analyze data for the public sector. This is standard. This is actually what we call the slim state. This has been happening for decades. Of course, we can also do it with business to government data. We talk about data access. Who handles the data is a different question. Of course, under the supervision with the responsibility of a public body.
Many thanks. I hope there will be opportunity to discuss the final act at one point. But this discussion I really enjoyed. And now we are coming to the second part of this discussion. Many thanks, first of all, to you. I would like to invite Marion Glatron from the city of Rennes. Marion is working for a very long time in the field of open data. Data governance is not a new topic for the city of Rennes. And we have invited Marion to tell us a concrete story when it comes to B2G data sharing. We have presentation, and I hope it will work. So Marion, please, we are really happy that you have come from Rennes to tell your story.
Well, thank you.
Successful story.
Successful, I hope so. Thank you very much for inviting me and inviting the city of Rennes to present our work on data. I just try to put on the presentation. Does it work?
Yeah.
Yes. To begin with, maybe some words on where I'm speaking from. Just a quick overview of what is Rennes. Rennes is a city and an area of 450,000 inhabitants, gathering 43 municipalities. And I must say we have a strong ecosystem of universities, startups, and non-profit organizations working together, and it's quite important to stress that point. We were the first French city to launch open data back in 2010. And we've been experimenting what we call the local data public service since 2018. Just after the bill that Szymon mentioned just before. So this is where I speak from. Just to remind, and I will be very quick on that point, that nowadays there is no local public policies without data. It's true for nursery or school enrollment. It's true also in public transportation and mobility. In this photo, you can see service on mobility on demand for disabled and elderly people. For instance, it's a service that we put in place in Rennes. It's true also for the reduction of wastes, public housing or flood protection. These are a few examples of where data is required to operate the public services. But you all know this. Well, my points can stand as follows. First, the national legislative instrument is of great help to access privately held data. It's true, for instance, in France since 2015 for with the law for energy transition. It has been also a great improvement with the Digital Republic law. And, for instance, and lately, the law for climate and resilience, which opens up new fields of data, of privately held data, to public action. What I want to stress, it's my second point, is it's not self-sufficient. What I mean by this is, whereas there are obligations for private sector to open their data, to share their data with local or national governments, there is still a great effort to give in making it effective. For instance, the data is not always available, and I would just like to take an example on that. In the waste field, we have a provider of service, household waste collecting, and they have to give us data on the weight of household waste bins. And this data nowadays is not of sufficient quality for us to exploit it. So the data is not always available as it should be. This is the first point. And it's an effort and a negotiation with the provider of this service to give a proper and exploitable data to the local government. The second point is that the data due to the local authority is not always accessible. What I mean by that, and we take another example, it's also in the waste field. We have developed our own LoRa network in order to make it possible for the municipality to have its own data. And we have the drop-offs, the voluntary drop-off stations where you can throw away your sort of some kinds of waste. And we had put sensors, LoRa sensors, inside these containers, in order that we can have a total hand on this data. And what we didn't had in mind exactly is that this data is going from the sensors to a network server and then to a data server, but it's not ours. It means inside the contract it was not clear where the data flows would go to. So even when the framework exists, it's an effort to have a real hand on the data. And my last point on that, not being self-sufficient, the framework, legislative national framework, is that the local authority, and it was stressed in the previous panel, the local authority is not always prepared to deal with these data, and it's a matter of competences, skills, tools, finances. Third point, there is a local legislative national framework. It's not self-sufficient. And if we want to activate it and to go a little beyond this framework, it is very useful to build a local framework for cooperation with private actors. And I want to take an example in the energy sector, just to remind that since 2015, the law enforces the energy distributors to share their data at a scale of 2,000 inhabitants or at the address, as long as there are more than 10 electricity meters at the same address. So, and it's by activity sectors, and of course it respects personal data protection and sensitive business information. It was a great improvement because we had on the table really more detailed data than we had before. Data concerning consumption, production, electricity grids, and renewable energies. So it was a great improvement, and I think that this national framework is an incentive for beginning to share data and look at it very precisely. I have to confess that it's not enough for local decision making. For instance, if you want to target actions for energy efficient renovations of buildings, or planning for renewable energy production, or putting smart grids in place. And this is why I want to stress now what the local framework for cooperation can bring. Telling that at a local scale there is an experimentation led in a cooperative way with Rennes Metropole, which you can see on the slide, but also the local agency for urbanism and the two distributors, which are national actors, GRDF and EDS. And it takes ground on a collaborative background in which several experimentations have been laid before, and I mentioned some of them with the logo you can see on the slide. So, the experimentation aims at defining a local mapping based on a fine knowledge of the territory that the local level can have, and to project energy consumption data on this new and fine mapping of the city, of the territory. Just a quick presentation of what I'm speaking about. It's a fine mapping based on the morphological knowledge of the territory, which means if you have more residential quarters or activity quarters, and when the buildings date back from. So, for instance, we can project physical data on this mapping, building heights, for instance, jointness, building volumes, the age of the buildings, but also vegetation. You can project environmental data on that scale, and that's useful for preventing urban heat islands, for instance, or limiting soil sealing. And this is what we used to project energy consumption data on that what we call morphological blocks, and I'm sorry for this barbarism. And this projection enables a better understanding of the consumption profiles in a district at a very fine scale. And it needs to mix data sources, for instance, real data for collective housing, but for the individual housing, we had to use theoretical data. And this theoretical data is made of a mix, a cross of different data sources. And my last point of the presentation is that I want to go to another dimension of the public local cooperation between public and private actors. stressing that we're trying to build a local data sharing platform which is multilateral. So we skip from a bilateral cooperation framework to a multilateral framework. The idea is to share what we've built with some particular actors, private actors, to share it and to make it possible for other actors to profit on what we've built together. And the platform we're trying to build is called RUDI, for Rennes Urban Data Interface. It's financed by European Union in an initiative called Urban Initiative Actions. It's for 3 years, and we have 12 partners involved in that, in the development of that platform. And it addresses 3 kinds of public: the citizens, and the idea is to make it possible for the citizens to know what data we have on them and to access it and to exerce their digital rights. It's a platform which is also accessible for data producers, be it national data producers or local smaller producers, and there is a wide variety of that type of producers of data. And the third public is made of what we call reusers or project holders, which come there to find data necessary for them to build their services. It can be private services or public services. So we have got 3 years to build that platform. And it's a matter of technical developments, but also of governance issues, which is, by that I mean legal issues, but also decision-making issues, economical issues also, and legal issues, of course. So this platform we're building, and I was really grateful to the debate we had yesterday and this morning, because I looked at this platform with another perspective, and I asked myself, okay, this platform we are building, is it a local and public data intermediary? Is it a soft infrastructure, as Marianne said yesterday? Is there here a role for a local data steward, and how to define it? Is it simply a local data governance that we are building? I think it's a mix of all these concepts that were discussed these days. And I want to finish my presentation stressing the challenge, reminding the challenge that we defined at the beginning of the project. And the challenge is to make it possible for local stakeholders to produce high-quality services using local data while respecting privacy and, of course, the values of public service. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, dear Marion. So I think it's always important not to discuss subjects at theoretical level, but to have really concrete examples. And now, following your last slide, maybe you're asking yourself, is maybe Data Governance Act also addressing my platform? But having in mind the previous discussion regarding the Data Act, do you believe that initiatives at European level could improve your work at local level?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I have to mention that we contributed to the consultation previously to the issue of the Data Act in preparation. Yes, I think it's important for us to have a national framework enforcing private sector to share their data, and I gave example of that. But I think it's also necessary for the European framework to work on it, because we, as a city, we have not enough power and enough strength to deal with all the private sector actors.
Meaning so, from negotiating point of view?
Yes, of course. And we are not such a little city. I mean, there are smaller cities than ours. So it's a matter of gathering together to make it possible to share the private health sector data on a basis that is common to different cities, for example. And I think the Europe has a great work to do on that point, and helping the city together and to make it possible for us not to negotiate with every private actor.
Many thanks.